Greetings, fellow Who Gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. And this week, we have a name for the next Doctor Who episode, the Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker finale, which is rumored to be airing sometime next month, October 2022. But of course, in true time-tested Chris Chibnall fashion, we do not have an air date yet, even though it's only about a month away. We have a new review of Doctor Who literature on Chartable via Apple Podcasts, and this is once again from John Featonby, who promoted the show on Twitter a short while ago, and I read that tweet out. Here is his 5-star review. This is a regular and tremendously rigorous deep dive into the Doctor Who Target books in release order. The content is thoughtful and sensitive, and Jason has that rarest of gifts, a pod-friendly voice. I love it. John, thank you so much again for helping promote the show and for the 5-star review. I think most of my listeners would not agree with you on my voice, but I thank you for the compliment all the same. As I announce at the end of every show, one of the places where you can find me on social media is on Twitter under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage. That's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. I am right now in my 24th month of watching Doctor Who in order, essentially 45 minutes a night, almost every night, with the occasional break for new seasons of Cobra Kai. I finished season 5, by the way. Excellent, although I have my doubts about the last episode. We can talk about that on a different social media stream if you wish. I started, of course, with Unearthly Child and Cave of Skulls, the very first 2 broadcast William Hartnell episodes in late October 2020, and here we are in September 2022, and this week I have just started on the Chris Chibnall era. If you're listening to this on release date, the other night, I posted my review of The Ghost Monument, which is the second Chibnall/Jodie story. If you are a frequenter of the Doctor Who Ratings Guide, Stacey Smith's wonderful compendium of Doctor Who reviews, I had posted a scathing review of Ghost Monument a while back after the second time that I'd seen it. The other night was the third time that I'd seen it, and I appreciated it a little more, but I didn't love it. So I posted a series of tweets for the episode detailing what I liked and what I didn't like. That's what I typically do for most episodes, which I don't have a strong opinion on, either for or against. I'm happy to announce that this was the very first time in the 24th month of the pilgrimage that I've been ratioed. A lot of people are very, very big fans of the Ghost Monument, and I was getting comments and reactions from folks who almost never interact with me on Twitter. That's how strongly folks feel about this. Now, on the one hand, you could say I got ratioed, and that means my opinion is not valid. I prefer to look at it this way. If you have Doctor Who fans coming together out of a spirit of positivity and love for a story, and that's certainly what happened with the Ghost Monument, even if I don't share the opinion, and I did respond to most of the engagements, if you have that level of love for a story, and that's what you're using Twitter for, keep on doing it. Let's flood Twitter with all the positivity and enthusiasm for Doctor Who that we can. I expect that there are going to be many other Chibnall episodes coming up, which I am not crazy about, which some of you all are. Just keep being positive, keep being enthusiastic. Let's make Twitter a better place for you and me and all the other Doctor Who fans out there. This week, of course, we are back in the classic series. We are back in season 11. We are in 1974, and we are talking about Death to the Daleks. This is, again, a story on which fandom is not united in universal love, at least on television. But when it comes to the novelization, the Terrance 1978 novelization, everything that I've heard, everything that I've read, everyone that I've spoken to, love this book. I am very happy to welcome a new guest to Doctor Who literature. He's somebody who's been involved with fandom and the show in varying capacities for decades, and he has some first-hand experience with the Target Publishing Office and the authors and the manuscripts going all the way back to the early days of the line in the 1970s. and he told me some terrific stories I'm very, very happy to share with you. My interview with Paul Simpson. Let's get to it. My guest this week has worn many, many hats in Doctor Who fandom over the years, enough hats to have a whole line of Patrick Troughton hat references in Season 4. He has been involved with Dreamwatch slash DWB. He has been a co-editor of the Black Archive series. He has been co-author of the book Who Beyond 50. Then he is co-founder and managing editor of Sci-Fi Bulletin. And I'm sure there are several other hats that I've missed describing as well. Paul Simpson, welcome to Doctor Who Literature.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I think probably the biggest hat you've not mentioned is that I'm lucky enough to be one of the team that works on the new Target novelizations as well, which is obviously something that I can't talk in detail about, but it is something that's been an honour and regularly is one of those pinch me. I'm getting paid to read a Target novel, a new Target novel that nobody else has seen before. Okay, this is good.
That would be crowning achievement, I think, for most people who love this little show of ours. How did you first come to read and then get to know the production office at the original Target books from the 1970s?
Well, going back, I'm a few days older than the show itself, so it has been part of my DNA. One of the earliest memories I've got is the Cybermen on the lunar surface in Moonbase, partly because apparently it scared the living daylights out of my sister, and therefore I wasn't allowed to have Doctor Who on for a bit. But my clear memories are from season 7 onwards, and Pertwee was very much my doctor. I got the original 3 books, the Daleks, Crusaders, and Zarbi from the local library regularly. Probably could do them from memory, and certainly one of my fun jobs in recent time was doing the proofing of the facsimile editions that we put out a few years back. And that really was stepping back in time, because it wasn't just looking at the Target editions, it was going back and actually looking at the text of those original ones. So I had those, and then when they came out in paperback, I picked them up and I got the first set, so Auton Invasion, Cave Monsters. I can remember where I was when we bought the Cybermen novel. We'd gone to see a show in London, and I had some Christmas money over. We went into a big store in Victoria Street, and they had it there. I hadn't seen the cover. Troughton, Cyberman, meow, that's mine. And I had that. Fast forward probably about a year, and we're into the sort of spring of 1976. And I've got a couple of the more recent books, and it probably would have been the Loch Ness Monster from the local library. So it was the hardback edition that had got the small autobiography. And in the back of the back flap of those books, there was a brief autobiography. And it said that Terrance Dicks lived in Hampstead. Ah, goes me. Looks in telephone directory, and we had, as you know from the infamous Dahl to Lek story, London telephone directories in those days were A to D, E to K, L to R, and S to Z, or Z as we call it. So I looked up Dicks, Terrance, spelt wrong, and it gave the telephone number, which it's still imprinted on my memory, but I won't say because it is the same one still. And I rang it up. And there's this 12-year-old boy just ringing up and saying, "Is that the Mr. Dicks who writes Doctor Who novels?" "Yes." "Can I come and talk to you about them?" "I suppose so." And that's literally where my entire Doctor Who career in this sort of thing started off. So I got to know Terrance. Through Terrance, got to know Mac Hulk, who lived literally. You came out of Terrance's house, you turned left, if I remember rightly, walked 10, 15 yards. You went down a little twitten, which is the a little alleyway between blocks. You turned right, and Mac's house or Mac's apartment was on the right hand side.
Wow.
And basically, at the end of term, myself and then friends, including a school friend called Ian Speed, another one called Owen Tudor, who's been involved with fandom for years, and then my oldest friend in fandom, David J. Howe, started coming along as well. At the same time, I was at school in southwest London, and the school was by Hammersmith Bridge, infamous for having Daleks appearing in the water next to it. That was on the other side. We were that's the northeast side. We were the southwest. But details. Um, you weren't supposed to go out from school at lunchtime. It's a private school. You were meant to stay in the grounds and do whatever it was that you were meant to do. Um, but I noticed that inside the books it said that they were published at 123 King Street. Me looks at map. Me goes, that ain't far. So I nip out from school. I literally walk along the towpath, go up onto the bridge, walk across the bridge, cut across, cut through a couple of side streets, and you come out on King Street, which was a lot less developed than it is now. Anybody who goes there now, it's been knocked down, redeveloped, I think a couple of times actually since then. And we're still talking about 1976, so early 77. And rang the doorbell of the office and said, have you got any Doctor Who stuff, please? And there were some young people on the staff there who, I don't know if they took pity on me. They thought it was completely odd. And it was. I mean, it was this schoolboy, aged 12 or so, asking for stuff. So they gave me various things. Started off with a couple of cover flats. So I had what if you took the back off a paperback book and you had it printed on better paper, that's a cover flat. So it's showing you what the front of the book looks like, shows you what the spine looks like, and it shows you what the back of it looks like. And they're used for proofing. They're used for publicity purposes. Obviously, we're going back to the days. We are long before anybody even had the bright idea of faxing or the internet or digital or all of that. We are analog with a capital An. So these cover flats are great. And I think the first one I had was Axos, and then definitely Ark in Space. And soon after that, Horror of Fang Rock, which explained that it was a story featuring Sarah Jane. Now, that information came from its author. Now, you may choose to feel that says something about the way in which Leela is written in the story, or you may not. Opinions differ. I know exactly what I thought when I saw it, and it made a lot of sense to me then. So they then also started letting us have probably strictly legally, well, properly, I mean, maybe not legally, early copies of the books. So I was sitting, I would go back to school and I was sitting reading a Doctor Who book that wasn't out for 2 months. Yeah, and there is something very, very, very cool for that, even if the vast majority of people around you couldn't care less what Doctor Who was. There was a group of friends who did, and that was the key thing. Through those meetings with Terrance and Mac, lots of little things came out. We were the first people to find out that he was Robin Bland. Because he was talking about, we were asked what the book was, and he was talking about adapting Robert Holmes' version of his scripts for The Brain of Morbius. And 99% sure it was David Howe and I were there, and we sort of looked at each other and went, but that's credited to Robin Bland. And Terrance laughed and told the story that we have all heard 3 million times about put a Bland pseudonym on it. Lots of lovely memories of that. We asked him if we, on one of the first times, I think it was the first time that David came with me, if we could have a copy of a manuscript. and he couldn't see a problem with that. And we wanted the manuscript that was on his desk, which was Dalek Invasion of Earth, which was still 4 months off publication. No, oddly enough, he wouldn't let us have that. Although he did very kindly when the book came out the next time we saw him, which was the Easter around the time the book came out, we went to, I think by that point, W.H. Allen had moved to Hill Street, which was a bit further away. That involved a subway, a tube ride to get to it, but this was not going to get in our way. We were still going there. And by this point, it was getting a bit mob-handed. There were sort of 4 or 5 of us turning up, asking for copies of The Deadly Assassin or whatever the latest book was. And that continued. And that continued nicely until Mac fell ill and subsequently died. He got some of the older people who came along involved with one of the world conventions down in Brighton that he was involved with, and kept in touch with Terrance for a short time. But then I sort of dropped out from fandom. I was involved with the Dwas film Oceans in the Sky, which was a fan film that my friend Owen Tudor and I wrote originally as a script for fun and to sort of film amateurly. It became the Dwas film, Doctor Who Appreciation Society film, done by a gentleman called Mark Sinclair. It's an interesting movie. If Mark hears this, he's very, very protective of it, and it is what it is. For the budget, they achieved some great things, and there is an elderly gentleman in the sort of Cushing mould as the Doctor. There's a new companion, and there's Daleks. But then I went off to university. I got involved. My career went more towards music and other things, and I didn't really stay involved. I stayed peripherally involved with fandom in the 80s and early 90s. I collected DWB. I religiously collected the Target books. But that was sort of the extent of it until I became involved with Dreamwatch. I was never involved with DWB as such. DWB, Doctor Who Bulletin, became Dreamwatch Bulletin when Gary realised that Doctor Who wasn't coming back. Not that there was any correlation with him spending a 6-year campaign trying to get rid of its producer. Yeah, no link there at all.
Yes.
But I came on board Dreamwatch, and one of my conditions was that the anti-JNT stuff stopped and the anti-Colin Baker stuff stopped. And actually, at one of the visions, Colin and I made peace on behalf of the magazine. And a little later on, under my tenure, a chap called Simon Gerrard, who later succeeded me as editor, actually interviewed John about it. And I spent some time with JNT and Gary in later years, so sort of got to know them. And so yes, that was sort of where we got involved. And then I think there was a signing connected to, it might have been Sophie Aldrin and Mike Tucker's book Ace, yes, at Forbidden Planet, that Terrance came to. We renewed our acquaintance, and for my 4 years in charge of Dreamwatch, we would quite regularly meet in London. We would run into each other in Forbidden Planet and end up in the local Weatherspoons, setting the world to rights for the afternoon. And he would ring his long-suffering wife saying, "Met one of my Doctor Who boys. I'll be back later." That was great. Yeah, again, when I stopped doing Dreamwatch, we lost touch again, and we sort of touch base at various different times over the years before his sad death, and unfortunately ill health means that I won't be able to go to the much delayed tribute that's coming up for him, but I did take part in a panel memorialising him at Gallifrey a couple of years back with David and Paul Cornell, which was lovely, bringing back some of these memories at that point, which is a very long answer to your very short question.
I will just point out, as the host of the show, I have two very, very brief intersections with you. You and I met very briefly in passing at the hotel bar at, I think it was the Visions 96 in Chicago, that Colin was at.
Yeah.
And then I was actually in the audience, third row, stage right, for the panel about Terrance at Gallifrey 1. This
Oh,
was
right. Okay.
probably right before the pandemic, I guess, would have been
It
2020.
was. It was. It was February. It was the last one I went to, February 2020. Yeah. Well, we must have been sitting very near each other because I was in the second row back in the middle. So yes, it was. It was one of those panels where there are so many people who want to be on it and don't need to be, but it ended up that very kindly my contributions, yeah, Keith and David and Paul ensured my contributions had a chance to be heard.
So, what amazes me is that all this begins for you with a phone call to an author just out of the telephone directory at age 12 and then
Yep.
knocking on the door of the production office. I started reading the books when I was 11, although, of course, I'm reading them in the States and I don't have much access to any information about London. I can't imagine if I were in your shoes having the charisma to make that phone call and knock on the door. That really set your life on a whole different course. It's incredible.
It's I can go back to that phone call. It's what set me on the course that I have done for the most of the last 30 years. I switched around the same time, going back to straight after your answer. That phone call was what set me on the course, absolutely, of my life, in terms of after I was quite seriously ill in the mid 90s and did not want to go back to what I'd been doing, which was sort of middle management. The opportunity at Dreamwatch came up out of the blue completely, and I discovered that although I'd done some editing on a very amateur level, um, that it was something that I was good at, and then discovered that interviewing was something that I was good at. And it's a whole different ball game, age 12 to 16, 17, sitting down with people. I mean, it wasn't just Terrance and Mac. I can remember talking to Ian Marter and having to explain that we couldn't meet in a pub because I wasn't old enough. That those sort of things stick in your mind. Tracking down Nick Courtney after Terror of the Zygons and long before Mordrin, where he was working in a shop and talking to him and saying, "Love to talk to you about it," and him saying, "I've left Doctor Who. I don't think I'm ever going back. I don't think anybody would be interested in what I've got to say." Now,
Goodness.
16 years after that, I worked with Nick on the first draft of Five Rounds Rapid, his autobiography. So things go in circles. But yeah, the in the mid 90s, that phone call, the phone call from Terrance, and then in the mid 90s, the going to the signing that they did at Dreamwatch did, and getting in touch with Gary Lee afterwards. Gary is a hate figure for a lot of people, and he often is for me. But I give him absolutely full credit for taking me under his wing and giving me an opportunity that I grab with both hands, and it's what I've done since 1995.
So you have been in the room with a lot of figures from Doctor Who have long since left us. Malcolm Hulke, 1979. Ian Marter would have been in the mid to late 1980s. Did you ever have the chance to talk to them about their novelizations, about their particular writing styles and choices?
Yeah, I mean, that was basically with Mac, certainly. Very much so, and quite a few of those interviews. I mean, if you go back to the Surbiton Doctor Who local group, which was the one that David Howe set up, they did a magazine that started off, if I remember rightly, unnamed, and it became Oracle. And a lot of those early interviews were in there. David transcribed them and put them in. What situation, how accessible they are now, I have no idea. I don't have copies of any of that stuff, but I do remember sitting with Mac and he basically, if he was in the days of computers, he would have done all this on Excel, but he had a chart, a graph piece of graph paper which had the number of pages in the book and the number of minutes elapsed in the episode. And he had a went from 0 to the top, so from bottom left to top right, and he would chart how he did it. Now, when I write books, and I've written 30 odd or so over the years, I did exactly that for my word count. Okay, I got Excel to do the calculation for me and create the graphic, but I got that idea from Mac, and it was so he could see, was he giving too much time to this part of the episode? Was he um, did he need to speed up? Did he need to slow down? I hope, I believe that David had some copies of some of those. I know David had copies of some of the scripts that Mac had, and he took them away, and an aunt of his, who was a typist, retyped them, not photocopied them, retyped them, which is dedication. Um, but I'm hoping that those, that some of those graphs still exist, and the forthcoming biography of Mac, whenever it comes, has had access to that. But yeah, we talked about it. We talked about the fact that he very much saw the books as a way of telling the story in that medium. So it was not, you had situations, the characters had to be more three-dimensional. So when you had also remembered that in those days, okay, the Sea Devils, we got lucky. We had a chance to see the Sea Devils twice in the 70s because of rain at Wimbledon or the cricket match. But basically, the difference between British and American readers of these books, particularly at the time, was that PBS reran stuff for you. They started with whichever their first episode was, they ran to the end, and they went back to the beginning. Over here, no, we didn't see that stuff. We didn't see episodes again unless we got lucky until J&T did the Five Faces. And that was the first time that a lot of people had seen Bill Hartnell on screen, had seen Pat Troughton on screen, an awful lot of people that they'd seen John Pertwee on screen. Bear in mind, how long, and particularly in the age of a kid, and how long you stay a fervent fan of something, that Tom was in the role. So for us, and for the authors, for Mac, for Terrance, for Brian Hales, maybe the three most prolific from that, Jerry Davis, prolific from that era, they were taking their stories and they were retelling them, not worried that there was going to be somebody, and I don't want to do the cliche, but the cliche unfortunate fan, the one who is sent up in the 1993 Resistance is Futile, or Resistance Useless documentary, that's sitting in the mom's basement and has got nothing better to do than to go between, oh look, in minute 25 he gives a nod and it's not there in the book. The book is wrong. Burn the book. There was none of that rampant stupidity because we didn't know. Okay, the Ian Levines of this world, the Paul Simpsons of this world, the David Howes of this world, we reel to reel recorded it. I'm sorting out stuff from my father's house at the moment, and I found the reel-to-reel recorder that I recorded some of that stuff. Now, there are tapes with it. At some point, I'm going to have to go through them in case there's any actual off-air stuff there. It might have some of the before or after stuff that doesn't exist elsewhere. I have no idea. But unless you were the absolutely rabid fan, you didn't have the access to what originally was there. And certainly in 1976, you didn't have access to a story that was broadcast in 1972. So long story short, again, they could go in and rewrite as long as it hit the key beats, which was what the books were designed to do. They were designed to remind you and to be in the way that the New Adventures wanted to be, too big for the small screen. And when that, I can remember when that slogan came out for the New Adventures, and but that's what the books always were meant to be. Yeah, the books were meant to be a retelling without worrying about the confines of Studio D at Riverside, or any of the difficult, the big blue lines around people, or whatever it was that was the that quote unquote Mars the TV version. Where you have an issue with that is, I think, some mid period of the Target novels where they did become a bit by rote. They did become a bit he said, she said. And that was very, very obvious to me when I proofed the Terrance omnibuses a few months back, because um, those were in chronological order of broadcast, not of book.
Hmm.
So we had Abominable Snowmen next to Wheel in Space.
Like night
Prime,
and day. Yes, I can
yeah,
see that.
prime, brilliant Terrance, adding stuff in, creating scenes that we're cross at Gary Russell for not putting in the animation, but they were never there in the original. Okay, Gary, I'm not that cross at you. I love that animation. When it gets out over in the States, buy it. It is one of the best. Um, but you had quite definitely Terrance in 1974 writing that, and the imagination that goes in, the whole thing that brings Tibet 1935 to life, that makes characters of Professor Travers, of the monks, of all of them, um, in a way that the Wheel in Space doesn't. The Wheel in Space is literally, because there's fast cuts in the episodes between the Cybermen say this, and then Jarvis turns the knob, the Cybermen said this, and Jarvis turned another knob, and each of those is a separate section with a line break in it, and that gets it up to 126 pages. Um, it's two different things. Um, and one of the things, and tying it back to Death of the Daleks, that this is ostensibly about. Yeah, I reread that last night for the first time in I have no idea how long. And it starts off with a great Terrance introduction. It's not quite up there with Through the Ruin of a City, Stalk the Ruin of a Man, but it's a good evocation of it. There are moments where where Sarah's in the trance, or being put into the trance before she's being sacrificed to the city, where we're in Sarah's point of view. We have the Doctor's point of view. We have moments that really aren't necessarily, and I'm sorry, Nick Briggs, I know this is your favourite story of all time, but really aren't very good on television, that are made up for. Um, it's still not a classic Doctor Who story, as far as I'm concerned. It's not. It'll never be up there in my top 10 Pertwee, let alone my top 10 stories. But it's an enjoyable four parts that Kerry Blyton should never have been let anywhere near. That'll get you a load of comments. No, I like Kerry Blyton's music. I like his music for this. I like Death to Daleks. It's just a combination of the two that don't quite work.
You never knew you needed saxophones underneath the Daleks.
Yeah, preferably the Daleks going over the saxophones. So we sort of had squash saxophones. Um, I still want to know why there hasn't been a big finished story about this. I don't know. Why are there little miniature TARDISes in the Dalek ship for them to test their weapons on? Is this standard issue? I know somebody else has raised this. I'm nicking somebody else's gag, but it really did. The minute I read that, I just thought, yeah, why? We should have this. Inquiring minds want to know.
So, one of the things that I've had the time to do on this podcast over the past year is track the evolution of the line and how writing styles change over the years. So, I
Hmm.
am now in mid 1978. I am about 4.5 years into Terrance's novel writing career. When I turn to Death to the Daleks, it is immediately after finishing The Time Warrior, which is a jumbo novelization, one of his longest, with, of course, the Robert Holmes penned prologue. When I turned to Death to the Daleks, and I noticed the page count was only down to 119 pages, having not read the book in about 25 years, I assumed it was going to be a very short read. I assumed it was going to be a fairly short script for me to read out at the end of the episode, and it's been the better part of a week. I am only halfway in, and what amazes me is you have a stretch of scenes in the middle of part one which are largely silent, which is really up to the director on location, finding things to uh, spend film footage on. You could easily imagine in the late 80s, Terrance or some of the other writers would have taken those largely silent scenes and transcribed them into about 7 or 8 lines of text.
Yeah,
Sarah went into the TARDIS. The Doctor wandered down a path. A shape appeared behind Sarah and tried to attack her. So Terrance turns that into probably a 10-page chapter in which there are only 7 words of dialogue, 6 of which is Sarah going, Doctor, Doctor. It is amazing to me that he's able to take this bare bones material at a point in the line where he's writing almost a book a month and certainly doesn't have the time to do this, and is creating an atmospheric chapter with hardly any dialogue, which is very unusual for Terrance because dialogue is always his thing.
a very practical point on this. Terrance had a contract, and that contract will state that this book is going to be X number thousand words. Now, if he's not got Terry Nation's dialogue to put in there and to account for X amount of that thing, he has got to do that. And that is something that it's the case now. I've spoken to a lot of people over the years who have novelized. I have a number of friends who've novelized movies and TV series. And it's the same thing. You are taking a very short script and you are turning it into a much longer, and often they're much longer, obviously now, even minute for minute, um, than the target books in those days were. But you still at the point that you have to produce this length of time, and that's what you're paid for. You're not paid for retyping Terry Nation's dialogue. You're paid to create that scene. Now, there is a fair comment to be made that some of the later stories weren't as atmospheric, and that capacity wasn't there. Therefore, the word count came down. But and I'd certainly say something like Image of the Fendal. I would love to read a um, more extended novelization of that, shall we say?
Mm.
But with something like this, also bear in mind that you've got Death to Daleks, who was script editor on it, who lived with that story for far longer than he probably wanted to. Who knew what he and Terry Nation had discussed, and what they'd gone, as you say, the director on location had gone, oh, with this quarry hasn't got this, we can't do that, or whatever. It was an opportunity. We're back to what I was saying earlier. It's an opportunity to present the story as it could be. My favourite of these of all time is Three Doctors, where there's a line in there about um, the third Doctor. The Doctor had always said that he could drive Bessie up the side of a mountain or something like that, and here he proved he could. Now you watch the Three Doctors on television, and you think, where the Lumineck did that come from? Because there's nothing like that. There's Bessie pottering along. There's and Joel God's going boo, 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 behind them with all the menace of a very small newt. Um, Actually, that's not fair to small newts. They can probably be more menacing than a gel guard. Um, but you've got, you see the point I made. It was a chance, and in the later stories, Terrance was working on stories he hadn't worked on. He didn't have that input. They they were stories that he knew. They were characters that he knew and loved. He probably wanted to cheerfully throttle them at times, but you can't throttle everybody. But you still come back to it. So yes, it's great that there are those sections, and I love the fact that, like in Time Warrior, we have the prologue that is takes a scene that ironically was cut from the original video release over here because of violence, Um, I think it's because of the. I may be wrong on this, but I think that the version of that episode that they had was an edited version, and that was what they could put out. I may be wrong, but I think that was the case. Either way round, it was, would be new to even, to somebody having seen the video a few years later.
So yeah, it just impresses me as I go book after book. I keep waiting to reach the point where Terrance's books get shorter and less detailed, but I am finding so many artistic choices. As you say, the scene where Sarah is being threatened with human sacrifice and is narrating it through her point of view with a lot of sardonic humor and observational wisdom. It's taken reading the book a much slower experience than I anticipated because there's so much detail that I want to point out.
Mm.
And speaking of correlating the page count to the time code, what always fascinates me about the Malcolm Hulk books, and sadly I'm almost at the final one, I have War Games coming up in about 6 weeks, is he will spend a lavish amount of pages just on episode 1 and episode 2 and will give us long detailed character biographies. So when you come to a book like the Doomsday Weapon, the adaptation of Colony in Space, you get a full chapter about Captain Dent. You have a full chapter about the two colonists who were killed in their dome. And then by the end of the book, when you get to one of the more padding friendly episode fives with lots of chases and escapes, Malcolm condenses that to about 12 pages in order to accommodate 50 or 60 pages on part one. So it always fascinates me that Malcolm and Terrance have such different styles, and yet their books have almost identical literary merits in terms of characterization and point of view.
Well, yeah, you could take two other authors who were producing books of those in those days: Alistair MacLean and Desmond Bagley, both adventure writers, both published here and in the States. So um, similar length books, similar types of story, completely different ways of telling them. You could read a chapter of one and chapter of the other. You know which was which. And again, Mac approached things with was a script writer. Mac wasn't a script editor. Mac was a storyteller, um, and he did it the right way to tell his story. I'm sure you're aware of the Paul Smith book on the big guide to all the Target books that gets regularly um, updated. And one of the fascinating things is the number of pages per chapter in the number of pages per episode on that. And you look at the War Games, and I think there's a couple of episodes of War Games that are half a page. It is tiny.
Yes.
Um, that you because they were written at the time to fill 25 minutes on a Saturday evening. So that the BBC, so quote Terrance's thing, they weren't putting out the test card. And some of those episodes don't have any more merit than that. So if you're memorializing them, and again, we're so pre-video that these books were the memorialization. And I think that's something that Mac came to appreciate from the conversations with those of us who talked to him about what they meant to us. Um, how much of a way of reliving the past they were. Um, that you would have, I think that was taken on board. Whereas Terrance had that from the start, and Mac had that innately. Um, but there always was this, we are telling the story in a way that in 40 years' time, somebody will have a TARDIS full of books and will be able to pick it up and relive 1917 First World War, in the war zone.
And talking about Ian Marter, I have one of his books coming up next week's show, The Sontaran Experiment, which is the first novelization of a two-part story. So Ian gets to use quite a bit of imagination in filling that out to 120 pages, or whatever the page count is. I have already talked on this show about The Ark in Space, which is very violent and visceral and reimagines the Wirren, both in terms of how they're spelled and in terms of how their biology operates. Now, I discovered the show in late '84. I found Ian Marter's books pretty quickly. Ark in Space was, I think, part of my third purchase of novelization, so very, very early on into my reading, and I just read that one over and over again because it was the first novelization where I'd already seen the TV episodes, and I was impressed at how much darker and grittier the book was. What was Ian Marter like? Because obviously the novelizations are violent and later on infamously use some rather salty language, but I gather that he was the nicest, most gentle man in person.
Yeah, um, I think that something I've learned very many, many, many times over the years. The nicest people on screen or in print are not necessarily so in real life, and vice versa. You do sometimes look at them and go, where did that come from? Do I really want to be quite so close to somebody who's just come up with that torture sequence? Yes, you stay over there. No, my memories of Ian, and this is going back, heading for 40 years, was that he was very kind to, yeah, a young writer, um, an aspirational writer. He was honest about stuff, but I'm quite sure that he was conscious of the fact that I was whatever I was at the time, 15, 16, and probably toned down. I suspect that if you talked to David or to one of the people who were 2, 3, 4 years older than me, who spoke to him and were nearer adult age at that point, their experiences would perhaps be, he might have been a bit more honest about stuff. My memory is that he was great fun to talk to. He was a great pleasure to be with. Um, he defended his decisions. Um, I can't remember. I know that we raised the whole thing about the fact that he would have to do Sontaran experiment because of the way that he'd altered the end of Ark in Space. And he laughed about that. And I can remember talking to Terrance about that, and basically Terrance going, that's going to be his problem. But, you know, in that time when Ark in Space came out, we weren't expecting two-parters to get books. There were an awful lot of stories to come out before we needed to go near the two-parters. Um, the fact that Ark in Space didn't include Sontaran experiments slightly, I remember, surprising me, because we'd already obviously had Giant Robot, we'd had Genesis, and we'd had Revenge of the Cybermen. So there was no other place that it could go except with Ark in Space, unless they did a book. Um, and it was great. I mean, without stepping on the toes of whoever is talking to you about Sontaran experiment, but it was one of those that fulfills what I love about what I'll call expanded universe novels, and the Target books are to an extent. They give you things that you didn't get or you couldn't get on screen. Meetings of characters that couldn't happen because, in a Star Trek experience, for instance, they're 60s characters and shows in the 2020s. All of these sort of things, or they take a reference from something and you get the Companions of Doctor Who series that I think was such a misfire and was such a shame it was, because I'd have loved to have seen the other books that were planned for that. Um, the you then go into the new adventures and everything like that, which is slightly different than expanded. But Sontaran experiment, and then you get other ones like Nigel Robinson's Edge of Destruction. They're the two that really stick in my mind for showing us things that we didn't know. Now, if I remember rightly, and somebody will correct me, and it might even be you, don't some of the details from Sontaran experiment that Ian put in the novel turn up in a later TV thing? I think in the modern era, there's an element that's brought in. I may be wrong about that. It may just be something that I saw somebody mention, but there was that whole thing is that the people who make the show now, Russell, Stephen, Chris, we all grew up on these things. We've all got the same. I'm 2 months younger than Russell. I'm a couple of years younger than Stephen. I'm a few years older than Chris. We've all got the same books. We've all probably got the same damned editions of the books. you know, and it's what's the to me. If I am proofing a Doctor Who story, or with the Black Archives, for instance, where I was checking a reference, I had to go back to a transcript and quite often to BritBox or to the Blu-ray or to the DVD to check the episode to make sure I was remembering the episode, not the version of the story I had read 400 times in my formative years. Yeah, how do you spell Padma's? How do you spell Osterley House? Um, all of those little things that were changed in the novels, um, that weren't, that were different in the thing. But if you're writing about what's on air, you've got to make sure it's what's on air.
That still happens to me. I was fortunate growing up in the New York City metropolitan area. I had, at the show's peak in the States, I had access to 5 different PBS stations that were showing Doctor Who on different schedules: Long Island, New York City, Boston, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So I was able to watch the bulk of the show in my first 12 months as a fan across the first 6 Doctors, which I gather most fans in the UK would have killed to have that level of access.
Let me put it this way: we're talking about 1984. At that point, we didn't have anything bar the laser discs and maybe Revenge of the Cybermen on video, if you had a video recorder or a video player.
Yes.
We had nothing. 84, we're going into the hiatus years. We got, I now can't remember, did we get a repeat of any of them? Did we get a repeat of Varos? That was 85 anyway. Did we get a repeat of any of Peter's stuff? Yes, I think we did. I think we may have got the 4-part version of the Dalek story, Peter's Dalek story. That was
Yes.
it. That was it. And you had that access, and I think that's why the Target books were so important to us, because they were our way of tuning into that station.
And then, of course, we got to the point as discovering the show, and I don't quite have the Mac Hulk spreadsheet, but I knew intuitively which channels were airing the show at which times, so primarily on Saturday nights or weekday evenings. So I always knew when to be in front of the television. In the mid 80s, the Targets start adapting the missing stories from the Hartnell and Troughton eras. So walking into the bookstore and finding Marco Polo was one of those transcendental moments for me. And then, of course, I discovered years later that the last third of the book bears very little relation to what was aired. So it wasn't quite the same as rediscovering the actual TV footage. Um,
That's before we get to the massacre.
yeah, yes, which I think has maybe about 12 or 15 pages in common, and that's it.
It has characters in common. I mean, I love the book version, and I love the audio of what we have. But they are two different stories, and it's almost a sort of flip flop. You can either have that version for Stephen and the Doctor, or you can have the book version for Stephen and the Doctor, and they meet up at the end. Yeah, both are not compatible. Whereas most times the book and the TV story are near enough compatible.
The Massacre, I think, the book has a happy ending, which, of course, the TV episode cannot be characterized in any sense as having a happy ending. So,
Well, I
very
think
much creative license.
Dodo Chaplet, she must logically be Anne Chaplets. Yeah, shall we just draw a gentle veil over that? No, the TV story has got a happy ending. It's got one of the best performances from William Hartnell
Mm.
that we are so lucky to have on audio. I'd love to see it, but for all of the faults of the massacre, for all the faults of whatever, that moment when Stephen runs out the TARDIS and Bill is there and wondering, can I go back? But no, I can't. They all leave me. And then we get She of the Amazing Performing Accents arriving.
Poor Jackie Lane. But as much as I had access to the show on television at ages 11 and 12, I was probably reading the books at this point more than I was watching them. So even to this day, I'll be rewatching an episode for the first time in X number of years, and I'll be expecting one of the Terrance changes for the novelization to appear on screen, and it doesn't. And I swear that my memory is cheating. But Paul, we've been talking for quite a while about the novelizations. You, of course, have worn, like I said earlier, many, many other hats in Doctor Who. So I want to talk a little bit about your current work. And I will not ask any of the burning questions that I have about your work with the current novelizations, the latest batch of which have not yet arrived in the States.
Enjoy them when they do.
Oh, I am planning on. Let's talk about Sci-Fi Bulletin. Is that a spiritual successor to Dreamwatch, or is that an entirely new project?
No, it's directly, basically, Dreamwatch. I left in 2000, um, having offered to buy it, which was turned down. A year later, Gary Lee sold it to Titan. I worked as a freelancer on that version, both the print version, which went for 5 years, and then when it went online as Total Sci-Fi Online. Um, Total Sci-Fi Online went offline at around the similar time to when I was leaving doing Star Trek Mag for Titan, and Brian J. Robb, who co-founded Sci-Fi Bulletin with me, was made redundant by Titan. We, along with Matt McAllister, who had been the um, editor of Total Sci-Fi Online, decided we would do our own version. Matt's career went a different direction. He moved away from it quite quickly. Brian moved more into the freelance writing, so it sort of fell on me. And then in 2016, I bought him out. Um, it is. I had a philosophy for Dreamwatch, which was that every article in there has to teach me something about the subject that I didn't know. The stuff that we have for Sci-Fi Bulletin works off the same basis. Interviews that I do or other people do, we won't run unless there's a very, very, very compelling reason. We don't run the puff pieces put out because they're not giving any sort of insight that people won't have found by going to much bigger following sites like SFX or whoever. Um, with the reviews, I want the reviewers to make me look at it differently. I challenge myself to do that. So, sometimes with some of our reviewers, I mean, we have a chap called Stuart Hodson, who is brilliant. His reviews on the Marvel stuff, his reviews on Underground Railroad um, are just, they are thought provoking, they are thoughtful, they don't pull their punches, and they make me rewatch the episodes. Um, and then the news, which I sort of do to keep it going because that pulls people in. So yeah, it is very much. It is not just a spiritual successor. It's my dream watch continuing. I only know one way of doing these things. So that's how we're doing them. And that's the idea in Sci-Fi Bulletin. Um, I had a heart attack at the end of last year, and I am eternally grateful to everybody on the team. We missed 3 days of not putting anything up. They just basically took stuff on, and I was able to use the laptop and or the iPad and actually press the buttons to put stuff there because we had the heart attack was out of the blue. We'd not set any systems up. Um, but they just took over all of the writing and all of that, and it would, the magazine, the website just continued, as I hope it will do for many, many years to come.
And you, of course, have done some work on the Black Archive series as well, which I came a little bit late to. They are not commercially available in U.S. bookstores, and it requires a special order, which Stuart mails out himself, which I certainly appreciate. But I am becoming a rapid customer of the Black Archives books, trying to fill in all the holes in my collection. What was your role on that series?
Initially, I it was purely helping out and doing a proofread on them, and the usual the thing that often happens, new thing comes through. I look at it, and if I spot something and it's early enough that something can be done about it, I'll contact the person and say, uh, "You spotted that typo." And most times, people take it in the spirits intended, which is not trying to put them down. Um, with Doctor Who, obviously, because of my knowledge built up over the years, I was able to look at things in my editorial hat, was able to read stuff and say, well, that may not be quite right, or whatever. That turned into when the editor was Phil Purser Hallard, working with Stuart on them. The books were popular, and they wanted to expand them. They brought somebody else in, but the time commitment, they are something of a time sink, the Black Archives, and it's no longer do them. And then I was asked would I be interested in coming aboard, and the first one that I did was Una's book on the Curse of Fenric, um, which was lovely to work on. It was a lovely thing to go in on. And basically, we had a system where one of us, Phil or I, was the main editor working with the author, and the other one was the copy editor. And we passed them back and forth between us, um, in the vague hope that we caught everything that might be questionable or wrong. Of course, we didn't. That always happens. We pass them to Stuart, who'd give them a read beforehand, and he'd wonder how the heck two people with the experience of Phil and I had managed to miss something so blindingly obvious as whatever. We all have blank spots. I'm a professional proofreader, but I know that I may not catch every single thing. And that's heresy to say, but it happens. And I long since gave up beating myself up fully about it. If it's something that I should have caught because there's a good reason why I should have caught it, different matter. So with the Black Archives, that we went to a monthly publication, which we realised was actually pushing us a bit too hard. Brought another editor, Paul Driscoll, on board, who contributed some great archives. My own situation changed in terms of what my time availability was. So I was stepping back anyway. I did numbers 50 and 51, which were written by Day of the Doctor by Alistair Stewart, which was the big spectacular one, which we had a great deal of fun on. And then Brian Robb's Earthshock, which was also great fun to work on. And then I edited Phil and Paul's own contributions that followed, but by that stage I'd stepped back and left it to them, and they've gone back to a bi-monthly schedule between them, which I think suits the range personally better. Gives time to concentrate on anything that needs sorting.
Suits my bank account as well. Reduces a monthly expenditure.
Oh, what for the reader? Yeah. But there are, whatever it is, 250 odd Doctor Who stories now. There are 60 odd Black Archives so far. That's about a quarter of them. Opinions differ on this, but I'm not totally convinced that every Doctor Who series has a Black Archive in it. But at least 3 of the ones that are out there now are ones I'd have put in that list, and I've been proved wrong. So I am Jon Snow. I know nothing. It's not my range anymore. I can't speak to it, nor should I. All I can talk about the time when I worked on it, and certainly at that point, we were always encouraging the writers to do what I have said earlier about SFB, that you should finish reading a Black Archive or a Silver Archive or the short-lived Gold Archives that we were doing on Star Trek before my heart attack. The first 3 of which are still out. The future of the range is still up in the air. But you should end that, and you should rewatch the episodes with a fresh eye. Now, I used to, on the ones I did, I would rewatch the stories before I started work. I would rewatch them afterwards, and I hope, and I think all the time, there was something. And I hope that there are going to be people who know Doctor Who a lot better than me. There are people who've spent their lives analysing this program. I've spent my life living in its vicinity, far more than certainly my parents and probably my wife would, be happy with. But it is part of me, and it will be. um, and it will remain that. And it's a part that I love. And the Target novels have been part of that, and the Black Archives have been part of that, and SFB and having the chance to go on set, through SFB has been part of it, and being part of the BBC Books freelance editorial team. So I've had, some input into the things, into the new novels and the new novelizations, and I will recommend without hesitation Robert Hack's illustrated Doctor Who and the Daleks that is coming out in November over here. I don't know when it'll hit the States. You may have the copy of Doctor Who and the Daleks, and I'm just picking up the facsimile edition that we did a few years back.
Oh,
You may have the Target Chris Achilleos cover one. You may have the Target Alistair Pearson cover one. You may have the White Lion edition. You still need this. It is an illustrations of the book. It is not illustrations of what was broadcast in 63, 64. It's illustrations of what David Whitaker wrote. And I would turn the page on the PDF and my jaw would drop. And I'd cheerfully give them that as a quote. It was one of those, oh boy, moments. And I so hope it's a success. That some of the other ones where the stories differ markedly, the Massacre being a prime example, that we get a chance to get a illustrated Target book that way.
we will wrap this up. I just want to ask you one last question. Anyone who has found this show, which goes very deep into the Target books, already knows which are the great ones of the range and which of the ones have a less than stellar reputation. I'm not going to ask for your what you think are the best ones because I think everybody would answer that the same. What are some Target books that are much better than people remember that are worth a second look that folks might not be thinking of?
Generally across the range, I think some of those first Doctor novelizations that Nigel Robinson commissioned, uh, things like the Alison Bingman's or whoever wrote its Celestial Toymaker. Um, there, I think ones that got slated. I think some of the ones that Terrance did, in that you know period where they were brief, they all have some merit. Um, I still have a lot of time for the State of Decay novelization. Um, you know, Fort of Doomsday might be by the book Terrance, but it's still Terrance Dick's writing. Um, the pre-New Adventures ones, when they're looked at as Target novelizations, are read very differently. Now that we know that they are the precursor to New Adventures, you read them differently. Now, Remembrance of the Daleks is the New Adventures book 0, but read it as a Target novel, and it reads very differently. So I can't. I mean, there's never been one where I have had cause to go into for whatever reason, whether it's connected to a modern novelization that's referencing it or to an article about it, where I have gone in and reread one of these and gone, why have I wasted my time? And I genuinely don't remember ever feeling that way about them. That's not the case with the New Adventures. It's not the case with the Missing Adventures. It's not the case with the novels that have come this century. There's some very, very good ones, but the highs are a lot higher and the lows are a lot lower. Um, the Target books, if you go into them remembering that their purpose was to enable children to remember stories that they had seen and to experience stories that they hadn't. And the key word in that sentence is children. That's fine. But Doctor Who is a kids' show. Okay, it's become a family show. But it is still. I knew that things weren't going right with this show when my daughter, who, she's 20 now, so has grown up with the new season, when she lost interest, there was something up. And she came back to it. It wasn't that she'd grown out of it, but there were periods where it was, I don't like this character, whether it was the Doctor or the companion or the storytelling. Um, and, Doctor Who is a kid's show. And as long as it's, Legend of the Sea Devils, I know kids who loved it. To me, personally, it didn't work. That's my opinion. I'm entitled to my opinion. I'm entitled to put my opinion, or Nick Joy, I think Nick reviewed that in the end, up on Sci-Fi Bulletin. What I'm not entitled to say is that that is the law, that is what things are. Um, and that's something I feel very keenly about. A review, an opinion is simply that. And everyone is entitled to have it. You're entitled to have an informed opinion, to quote Harlan Ellis. If you ignore facts, that's on you. That's stupid. That's on you. But you are entitled to have an informed opinion. Here endeth the gospel.
Paul Simpson, thank you so much for joining me on Doctor Who Literature. This has been a lot of fun, and we'll have this episode up in a couple of days. Doctor Who, Death to the Daleks, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as Death to the Daleks, teleplay by Terry Nation, televised in February and March 1974, published in July 1978. A mysterious power loss strands the TARDIS on Exelon, a sinister fog-shrouded alien planet. Forced to brave the dangers of the planet, the Doctor meets the survivors of a beleaguered expedition from Earth, searching for a precious mineral that can save the galaxy from a terrible space plague. Sarah finds a mysterious super city and becomes a captive of the savage Exelons. And worst of all, the Doctor's greatest enemies, the dreaded Daleks, arrive on a secret mission of their own. What terrifying power makes captives of all who come to the planet? What is the secret of the mysterious deserted city with its great flashing beacon? And what sinister plan has brought the Daleks to Exelon? The Doctor and Sarah must risk their lives time and again in a desperate attempt to foil the Daleks and save millions of humans from the horrific plague. Death to the Daleks is one of those stories for which I have an irrational love, far out of proportion to the TV serial as written, produced, and in some instances acted. It's because it's one of the few Pertwee stories I was able to watch when they first hit PBS on New Jersey Network in 1985. NJN aired those things in movie format starting at 11 p.m. on Saturday nights. That was usually my parents' time to get the one TV that had the cable hookup. For those of you born after 1985, the struggle was real, man. I'd occasionally get to watch some Pertwees, but at age 11 or 12, was just as likely to fall asleep around midnight, meaning that it was a few more years before I found out who Doctor Who and the Silurians or the Demons ended. But Death to the Daleks I was able to watch, and I remember that it aired the week before my first Doctor Who convention, July 27th, 1985 in Manhattan. See episode 17, The Three Doctors, for more of that story. In fact, I remember sitting in the convention ballroom at the now defunct Roosevelt Hotel, watching the Dalek invasion of Earth, and being impressed that the Dalek flying saucer props were similar between the two stories. So when I watch Death to the Daleks now, it's always through the rosy overlay of July 1985, and never with a critical eye. Well, hardly ever. Also, this Roy Knipe cover painting, The Exploding Dalek, rightfully proclaimed as one of the best Target covers ever. In fact, true story. For a few years I had a classic series-themed column in Enlightenment, the official fanzine publication of Canada's Doctor Who Information Network, commissioned by then editor Graham Burke, who you can hear on this show on episodes 16 and 38, and hopefully several more future episodes after this one. I called my column Dalek in Manhattan, never minding that I was living in Los Angeles and then Brooklyn across the years that I wrote it. And Graham chose a detail from this cover illustration as my author photo. I'm real proud of that. That's my association with this cover. The novelization itself is 119 pages long, which at this point in his target career, January 1974 through the present, was on the lower end of the Terrance Dicks range. But what a beginning! Death begins with a brief film clip of, I think, Terry Walsh, the stuntman, playing a slain Earth astronaut. Terrance turns this brief, no-dialogue TV scene into an incredibly vivid prologue. Not quite the same level as Robert Holmes' 10-page prologue for The Time Warrior, as we discussed last week in episode 42, but really strong material. He was a dead man, running. He ran, blindly, desperately, through the swirling green fog, deep, sobbing breaths rasping into his tortured lungs. He knew there was little hope. Somehow he had been separated from the others in the ambush, and now his enemies were hunting him. Without checking his run, he glanced back over his shoulder. Shadowy figures were flitting through the dunes behind him. His foot slipped on a loose rock and he pitched forward onto his face. He rolled over, scrambled to his feet, and ran on, snatching another quick look behind him. This time he saw nothing, but he knew they were all around him, herding him across the dunes like a hunted beast. As he ran, confused memories flashed through his mind. Selection for this all-important mission, farewells to family and friends on Earth, the landing on this isolated hell planet, and then disaster. A superbly equipped expedition from one of the most advanced cultures in the galaxy, suddenly and utterly helpless. If you've heard last week's episode, you know that Conrad would read this better. I think the words are excellent even if it's merely my scratchy voice doing the delivery. The words set a fatalistic, gloomy, violent tone and give the coming book a sense of foreboding, which the TV serial doesn't quite match. For example, the last two sentences. As its darkness swallowed him, his last bitter thought was that he had failed. His entire mission had failed, and because of that failure, untold millions would die a hideous death. Chapter 1 doesn't quite measure up to the prologue either. A breezy, comical TARDIS scene, Terrance omits John Pertwee's characteristic singing of old pop standards, followed by a very rapidly portrayed TARDIS power loss and landing on Exelon. There are a couple of minor changes. In the book, Sarah notes that she needs a life jacket in her bath, and in the book she intuitively knows that they haven't landed on Florana. But there's very little of Terrance's trademark observational humor or sarcasm, just really a straight retelling of the camera scripts. Until the final two paragraphs, where Terrance really gets into describing how the Third Doctor gets totally absorbed just observing a lump of rock. Quote, "The Doctor went on with his examination. The monolith could be of natural origin. It was perfectly possible that swirling sandstorms had gradually shaped the rock pillar into its present fantastic shape. Or was it a statue of some kind, worn away by the passage of time? Then there was the other theory he mentioned to Sarah. Perhaps it was some creature of the planet, dead for untold thousands of years, petrified into its present form. Perhaps it had once been one of the planet's intelligent life forms." Chapter 2 is a remarkable bit of Terrance extrapolation, made up as it is of several near-silent TV scenes that contain a grand total of exactly 7 words of dialogue. 7, one of which is the word blood, and the other 6 of which are the word doctor. You won't hear the word doctor uttered that many times in succession again until Logopolis. Terrance here has to write several action sequences, the Doctor being attacked by Exelons, Sarah Jane being attacked by Exelons, the Doctor being attacked by human astronauts. But even while retelling wordless action sequences, Terrance throws in some laugh-out-loud sentences. Page 17. "You could hardly be expected to tackle some alien monstrosity when you were wearing a bathing suit," to cover Sarah's scripted Part 1 wardrobe change, one of Terry Nation's less realistic means of contriving to separate the companion from the Doctor so she can be captured and put to human sacrifice. Terrance continues to work humor into the potentially monotonous fight scenes, As the Doctor on page 25 realizes that he's being attacked by a human and not an Exelon, because the knife at his throat is made from a single piece of metal, a spaceman's knife, Terrance writes. Interesting as this was, there were more urgent problems. Chapter 3 on its first page introduces two human cast members. One seems important, but won't be. The other doesn't seem important, but will be. Terrance writes, quote, Galloway, the one who'd attacked him, was big and burly, with a barrel chest and great hairy hands. The second man was considerably smaller and several years older, with thinning hair and a lined, careworn face. On TV, that second man, Railton, is played by John Abineri, who'd been the main villain in my beloved Ambassadors of Death a few seasons earlier. You assume he's going to be the principal human character and the Doctor's staunchest ally. The aggressive Galloway, you figure, will be cannon fodder. After all, this story, scene by scene, is virtually a carbon copy of the previous season's Planet of the Daleks, Spyridon last year, Exelon this year. A ragtag marooned expedition of Thals, a ragtag marooned expedition of humans, the Daleks showing up at the end of Part 1. Galloway is clearly this year's Weber, and Railton is clearly this year's Taran. Or maybe that's Jill Tarrant as Taran, or maybe Taran from the Keys of Marinus. Terry Nation loved that word. Except, Railton will not make it through the beginning of Part 2. And Galloway, the human antagonist, is never exterminated by the Daleks the way that Weber was. As Terrance writes on page 30, the Doctor felt somewhat overwhelmed with all this new information. Chapter 3 has a lot of subtle changes from the TV that are worth discussing. I expect Terrance was working from an earlier version of the script, or maybe was just feeling creative. Jack, the Terry Walsh character, is never found on TV, but in the book is found, quote, stuck full of arrows like a hedgehog, and buried. On TV, the Doctor gets out an ad-lib translating MSc as Master of Science. That is not in the book. In the book, Railton's a civilian. On TV, he's part of the Marine Space Corps and a captain. On TV, Galloway, in case you missed it, is very, very Scottish, using the words we and lassie in his first studio scene, and not in the same sentence.
What happened to him?
The Exelons took us by surprise, right after we landed.
These stone knives of theirs have got some sort of poison on them. We're dirty wee fighters.
I'm sorry, perhaps we ought to introduce ourselves. I'm Captain Railton, second in command of the expedition, and this is Commander Stewart. And that's Jill Tarrant, our civilian geologist.
Are you from Earth?
In a roundabout sort of way, yes.
Dan Galloway.
Lieutenant Galloway is our weapons officer.
Well, it would have saved me a few bruises if we'd shaken hands the first time we met. Hello, how do you do?
The chap outside is Lieutenant Peter Hamilton.
Lieutenant, are you a military expedition?
MSc,
Master of Science?
Marine Space Corps.
Now, maybe you'll tell us about yourself. Where were you heading when I jumped you?
Back to the TARDIS. That's my spaceship. I have a young companion with me, Sarah Jane Smith, and I hope she had the good sense to stay inside after I was captured.
Where is the ship?
Well, it's not far from here.
Well, if the lassie stayed in your ship, she should be safe enough.
As if. But Sarah is rather headstrong. By now, I expect she's out looking for me.
In the book, Galloway's accent is removed, and the long TV exposition scene is broken up across chapters 3 and 4 to allow chapter 3 to end on Sarah's capture. Terrance dips into Sarah's head on page 31 for a comedic observation. Hot, tired, and thirsty, Sarah stumbled on. Perhaps the city would be a kind of Arabian Nights palace, she thought. There would be cool courtyards with gently splashing fountains, and white-robed attendants with long, cool drinks in golden goblets. Spoiler alert, there won't be. Terrance adds material, retaining presumably deleted dialogue for TV, in Chapter 4, where Galloway rebels against the Doctor trying to give advice to the stranded Space Marines, while Railton eagerly accepts. Speaking of short, take any one or two random expository paragraphs out of the text, you'll see how much detail Terrance pours into even a 119-page adaptation of, let's face it, not Doctor Who's finest script ever. The following two-paragraph section, page 33, gives us the entire history of Exelon, from culture to landscape, and works in a funny 1970s-era space-age astronaut menu. Quote, munching on a tube of food concentrate and washing it down with water from a plastic bulb, the doctor listened to Railton's account of the planet Exelon and its strange inhabitants. The planet itself was bleak and barren, consisting mainly of sand dunes, rocks, and deserts with little vegetation or animal life. It was freezing cold and foggy at night, almost unbearably hot by day. Exelon was a very old planet with most of its resources drained and exhausted. It was Railton's theory that the planet had once been the home of some super race which had since died out, or perhaps moved on to some other world. Certainly the present-day Exelons were no more than ferocious savages. They had no civilization, no machinery of any kind, only the simplest of weapons and tools. They appeared to live in a vast network of caves which honeycombed the planet, lurking underground by day and coming out mainly at night. They were fiercely hostile, refusing all attempts at friendly contact and attacking all strangers on sight. They could never have built anything like the city, concluded Railton. The doctor finished his food cube, wondering why no one ever managed to make the wretched things taste pleasant. This book could have been 3 times as long as it was, but it's hard to be more efficient and descriptive than this. Our description of the Exelons on page 38 is also pretty vivid, and with a good handful of vocabulary builders for your average 8-year-old reader. Words like brutal, misshapen, degenerate, bestial, barbaric. Sarah rather poetically analogizes the Exelon's underground caverns to a church, the lead Exelon to a vicar. Interestingly, while the Exelons speak English on TV, Terrance here has Sarah unable to understand their language, except in context, figuring out from their tone and gestures what's about to happen to her. In the book, one of the Marine Space Corps soldiers says that they speak a sort of pidgin galactic. On the other hand, when the Daleks first arrive, Terrance greatly economizes on describing their visual look, assuming everyone knows a Dalek, but gives their voice an emotional impact. Quote, the metallic, grating voice that the Doctor had known and hated for so long. End quote. On page 44, Terrance adds the detail that Galloway lost his entire family in the Dalek Wars. An interesting point that possibly explains the character's antagonistic attitude, but doesn't explain why he so readily works with the Daleks on TV. This does improve Galloway's noble self-sacrifice at the end of the story, as we'll discuss between now and the end of the episode. This may have been a scripted line that got cut for timing, rather than a Terrance invention. Terrance also adds in wry lines from the Doctor's POV, describing the unusual nature of his alliance with the Daleks in Part 2. A new sensation to enter a Dalek ship of his own accord. Trust a Dalek to make even an agreement sound like an order. Elsewhere in Chapter 5, Terrance doesn't do anything to play up Railton's shockingly quick death, but there is added material as the Doctor and the Daleks discuss the strategy of appearing to surrender to the Exelons. That might have been wonderful dialogue on TV, but the novelization is the only place you'll find it. The nifty words used to describe the Exelons aren't Terrance's only vocabulary trick. Your other favorite Terrance words are here too. The word gleaming, as always, appears several times. Galloway is described as burly at least twice. Terrance adds more observational humor into the second half of Sarah's ritual sacrifice scene in Chapter 6. Quote, it was a funny thing to say about your own sacrifice, thought Sarah, but she was beginning to get rather bored with it all. After the Doctor tries to rescue her, and they both wind up in a prison cell, she thinks, first a church, now a zoo. Chapter 6 also sees added villainy for Galloway, musing out loud that he has a dislike of the Doctor in common with the Daleks. And the Doctor's TV warning to Jill about her, quote, space chums, in the book is modified to finger Galloway only. As the Daleks use their new projectile weapons to kill some Exelons, Terrance adds a poetic, lingering glimpse at the alien corpses. The blood of the Exelons soaked into the rocky ground. Chapter 6 also ends with a remarkable 2-page description of Galloway refusing to surrender command over his dying commander's orders, and reflecting on his own greed. This is a fine character study. And I can't stress this enough, I continue to be impressed how much notable detail fits into these 119 pages. Page 58. Dan Galloway stared down on his commander's body. They had never got on. Not that Galloway got on with anyone very much. They had clashed over Galloway's ruthless methods on previous expeditions. and Galloway suspected that the commander had blocked his overdue promotion. Dan Galloway was essentially a simple man. He had lost all his family in one of the early Dalek wars, grown up as a ragged, poverty-stricken refugee, joined the Marine Space Corps at the first opportunity, and clawed his way up from the ranks. Morals and ideals were the kind of luxuries he had never been able to afford. He had only one standard of behavior. Whatever helped Dan Galloway to succeed was justified, even if it meant cooperation with the Daleks. He wondered if Commander Stewart had been right about his motives. The man who brought this expedition to a successful conclusion would be a hero on 100 planets, rich and famous for the rest of his life. Why shouldn't he be that man? In any case, motives were unimportant. Results were what counted. This expedition had to succeed, but not with Peter Hamilton in command. He was too soft, like Railton and Stewart before him. Chapter 7 opens with observational humor, again, with Terrance giving us the most doctorish trait imaginable. Sarah thinks, quote, "No doubt the doctor had some brilliant plan. In fact, the doctor had no plan at all, though he was desperately trying to think of one." Chapter 8 is named Belial, named after the doctor's pseudo-companion for the second half of the story, but Belial is first introduced not by name in Chapter 7, page 66, where he's seen oozing out of a crack in the tunnel wall, quote, like toothpaste from a tube. That's one of the great similes, isn't it? Truth. In keeping with the theme that Terrance comes up with a zinger of a line every couple of pages, I love Sarah's reaction to meeting Belial in Chapter 8. Sarah thought it was bad enough being on this planet, without having to listen to a lecture on its politics. This may well have been Terrance planting tongue-in-cheek and commenting on the script, almost every line of which is some character's mission statement, rather than the kind of organic conversation that makes up real life. Also in this chapter, the Doctor takes the time to mentally analyze how the city's root probes function, as he hides from one and tries to outwit it. One might possibly think that Terrance put more thought into the working of this probe creature, the Part 2 cliffhanger creature, than the story's credited writer. Terrance also uses different dialogue from TV. The somewhat amusing Route 1, Dalek nil, becomes the much sharper Route City 1, Dalek United nil. Even as an American over the age of 30 who didn't grow up following football, or soccer, as we mostly still call it here, I can appreciate that reference. Another example of Terrance trying hard to bring some reality and scientific thought to a rote-by-the-number script is at the top of Chapter 9, page 78, as the Doctor deduces that Belial must have sonar-like hearing in order to be able to navigate his way through the tunnels, which, as was common for tunnels on televised 2 in the 60s and 70s, were brightly lit with no visible light source. Terrance is also pretty merciless towards Galloway, as we discussed above. Page 80, quote, "Galloway had no particular objection to bullying and threatening the Exelons, particularly if it would get the work done quicker. But to act as errand boy for the Daleks offended his dignity." Chapter 9, while it deletes a short TV scene featuring a gold Dalek, features another Terrance Dicks staple, an invented menu that characters eat, typically during Part 3 exposition scenes. Here, Belial's history of the Exelon city. Quote, "It wasn't much of a meal. Brackish water in a stone jug, some coarse black bread, and a few wizened fruits. Never mind Gary Downey's Doctor Who cookbook. Let's get someone to publish the Terrance Dicks cookbook and have Toby Hadoke prepare some of those recipes. Well, maybe not this one. Brackish water and wizened fruit may be realistic to Exelon, but would not make for the most riveting Blu-ray special feature." You can find more of Terrance's added realism in Chapter 10, as he gets into the mechanics of mining for perineum, explaining that its seams run in inner stripes that are difficult to get to, especially without power tools. And he has Sarah fall asleep during the second half of Belial's long, trademark Part 3 exposition. Once again, you sense that he's slightly making fun of the script, and continuing with the theme of adding more layers, and much fewer Scottish mannerisms to Galloway. Galloway here, after telling Peter that they must cooperate with the Daleks to destroy the Exelon City's power-draining beacon, adds under his breath, "for the moment," a line you won't hear on TV. Chapter 10 also ends with what would have been the original Part 3 cliffhanger, until the episode running time was shorter than expected, and material had to be ported over from Part 4 to form a new and decidedly more bizarre cliffhanger. I won't play the audio clip, which won't do it justice, but it's the crash zoom on the chessboard pattern on the Exelon City's floor. That comes 4 pages into Chapter 11, in what should have been the early minutes of Part 4, rather than a cliffhanger in its own right. One thing I genuinely love about Death to the Daleks is the series of intelligence tests and traps in the city of the Exelons. A problem that you had to solve with intellect and wit, rather than brute force. To slightly misquote Craig Ferguson's version of the Doctor Who theme, this appealed to me greatly at ages 11 and 12, when I'd washed out of Little League Baseball and wouldn't pick up a football, an American football, though I'm happy to announce that I'm now able to throw a passable spiral. Robert Holmes, who script edited and likely rewrote a non-zero number of scenes for the final version of Death to the Daleks, even calls back to it 2 years later in a similar moment in Pyramids of Mars. Terrance adds depth and atmosphere to what's already strong material. The Daleks looking around for the disappearing Doctor and Belial with almost ludicrous surprise. As the Doctor tries to solve the wall maze, Terrance writes, "Something told him that he would only be given one chance. If his fingers strayed from the correct path, the maze pattern would fade, and the exit door be closed forever." That line stays with me to this day every single time I try to solve a maze. In fact, I regret not telling Terrance that when I met him the one time in 2014. Instead, I made up an anecdote about working the phrase wheezing and groaning into an opening statement in court, which I, alas, as yet have not figured out how to do. The Exelon floor maze, too, would be reused by Terrance himself in The Five Doctors, and I think the sequence works better in the latter story, where the problem is solved by the Master's intuitive leaps rather than the sonic screwdriver. But it shows that both Holmes and Terrance enjoyed this material greatly. Suggested, of course, by Terrance's line in the book, Daleks take no interest in the finer point of interior decoration. Chapter 12, The Nightmare, features several changes from the TV, some likely based on the original script, and others on Terrance's own embellishments. There are scenes on TV shot from the POV of the dead Exelon in the main control room, but Terrance does not write it that way. When Belial is mind-controlled by the city, he menaces the Doctor with a Dalek gun on TV, but tries to strangle him in the book. Terrance adds a lot more description of the physical ordeal of Galloway and Hamilton, trying to climb to the top of the power-draining beacon, adding the marvelous line, after the pair have climbed one single step, "We do that a few hundred times, and we'll be at the top." Chapter 13 again sees some minor but interesting alterations from the TV material. Again, Terrance leads into the physical discomfort of Hamilton and Galloway, suffering from their task. Quote, "Ignoring the pain in his aching muscles, Peter Hamilton dragged himself onto the topmost ledge of the beacon tower. Gasping for breath, he reached down and took the bombs Galloway passed up to him, stowing them well away from the edge. Then with one final heave, he helped Galloway to scramble onto the ledge beside him. For a moment, the two men lay there, gasping, recovering from the tremendous effort of the climb. It had been a nightmarish business, all the worse because it had been so repetitive. They had repeated the same set of actions over and over again, working themselves and the bombs up the endless ledges. Now at last, they had reached the top." On TV, the humans use one Dalek bomb and keep the other. In the book, the power-draining beacon has 4 legs to which Terrance uses an Eiffel Tower comparison, and the humans are given 4 Dalek bombs, one of which Galloway keeps for himself, explaining to Hamilton in the book, but not on TV, that it's the only weapon they have, quote, "and we're taking it back with us," end quote. However, while Terrance plants a lot more foreshadowing of Galloway's looming self-sacrifice, he does not include, on page 113, the TV bit where a Dalek self-destructs after failing to prevent Jill Tarrant's escape. Although Terrance does on the very next page again include a sardonic dig at the Daleks, quote, "Daleks have so little imagination that it is almost impossible to hypnotize them. LOL. What this chapter shows is that Terrance takes a story, if you will, a weird, fantastic adventure with improbable and illogical events, and adds human emotions, stick characters on TV who have inner lives in the book, who can feel fatigue, or betrayal, or curiosity, or exhaustion. All and less than 119 pages. Paul Simpson made the point earlier in the program that the 1990s books didn't pack as much into 250 pages as the targets often did into 125 or less. I don't fully agree with Paul on that. I am an NA and an MA guy, but we come from different generations of fandom, and I came of age with the NAs and the MAs as much as he did with the novelizations. However, the point remains, and I certainly agree with Paul here, that Terrance tells a complete, three-dimensional, self-contained adventure from a script that contains almost no traces of naturalism or humanity. Chapter 14 is titled The Last Victory. Having the word last in the last chapter title is rapidly becoming peak Terrance, but after two straight books ending in chapters called The Last Battle, a la C.S. Lewis, as we've discussed before, this is a slight variation. As Hamilton and Galloway load sacks of sand, what the Daleks believe to be the vital perineum, onto the Dalek saucer, on TV we just see a couple of burlap sacks tossed into a corridor. But in the book, the book, quote, Hamilton dumped his bags down any old how, but Galloway began stacking his bags neatly in the hold, again building up to Galloway's noble suicide plan. Terrance putting more thought into this than perhaps you'd get on screen. Terrance also embellishes, possibly via the original script, possibly via imagination, to have the Doctor realize that the Daleks were lying all along about having the space plague, and that the Daleks are in fact immune. Though having the Daleks hoard the plague cure in order to extort human colonies is, to quote the King's Demons, strictly small time villainy by their standards. Galloway in the book consciously blows up the Dalek ship with himself on board to settle the argument with the late Commander Stewart, who'd accused him of being a glory hunter. In some trademark efficient but memorable prose, Galloway takes his own life, and the Dalek menace with him, by pressing the bomb's plunger with, quote, a deep, shuddering breath. The book goes on for an extra beat longer than TV, with the Doctor promising to finally take Sarah Jane to Florana, and with her asking firmly to go home instead. The TV episode ends with the 699 Wonders of the Universe line, and that's probably where the book could have ended too, but for me the deep, shuddering breath is as fitting a final line as any. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, the Target books take their longest break since 1974, and we're about to go 4 months without a new paperback release. When we meet again next Sunday, we'll have gone from the July heat to the November frost, missing entirely Jason's first day of kindergarten in September, and the Yankees-Dodgers World Series Battle of October. Spoiler alert, the Yankees win it in 6 after dropping games 1 and 2 at Dodger Stadium. You and I will instead be in a typical English village, in the shadow of a space-age satellite dish. Or will we be in an expensive training ground, and probably built on an irradiated, impoverished, dying planet? Get your eye patches ready. And for my American friends with our Pinnacle rather than Target editions, get out your Harlan Ellison introductions. Terrance Dix, get out your most sarcastic I hate this script prose. Join me and an American guest, a third-time Doctor Who literature guest, as we ruthlessly but merrily dissect Doctor Who and the Android Invasion. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Mr. Paul Simpson. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.